I wiped the sweat off my brow, leaving a streak of soot across my forearm. The forge was running hot, the iron glowing in the dim light of my workshop. My name's Spencer Bowden. I'm 52 years old. I own Bowden Forge, same as my father before me, same as his before him. Been working iron since I could hold a hammer, and I built my life the way I build steel: heat, pressure, and a damn good grip. Joanne used to watch me work, back when we were younger. Said she liked the way the fire made my skin shine, how the sparks danced off the anvil. Lately, she stopped coming around. I wasn't a man to poke around in things that didn't concern me, but a man knows when something's off. She started coming home later than usual, smelling like someone else's cigarettes, someone else's car. I didn't ask questions. Not yet. You don't swing a hammer without aiming first. The first real sign was Ray Gentry, the town's most washed-up, know-it-all cab driver. He used to be a reporter before he got canned for writing the wrong story about the wrong guy. Now, he drove drunks home and peddled gossip like a man who knew exactly how the world worked but couldn't be bothered to change it. He leaned against his beat-up Ford one evening while I was locking up the shop. "Hell of a thing," he muttered, lighting up a cigarette. I tightened the leather strap on my wrist and looked at him. "What's that?" "Just funny how folks start picking up new habits." He exhaled a slow stream of smoke. "Like your wife taking late-night rides. Regular passenger these days. Got a preference for the south side of town." I didn't ask where. He wanted me to. That's what Ray did. He cast the bait and waited to see who bit. I wasn't giving him that satisfaction. "A lot of people go south," I said. Ray chuckled. "Yeah, guess so." I walked home, my boots heavy on the pavement. Joanne was in the kitchen when I got there, stirring something on the stove. She turned when I walked in, gave me a quick, practiced smile. "You're late," she said. "So are you," I answered. Her hand paused for half a second before stirring again. "Had a meeting about the fundraiser. The community center's running low on donations." I set my bag down by the door. "That right?" She nodded. "Too fast." I sat down at the table, stretched my hands out on the old wood, my knuckles still raw from hammering steel all day. "Who's running it with you?" She didn't look up. "A few folks. Janice, Marla. Some others." "Some others." I picked up my fork, but I wasn't hungry anymore. 2 nights later, I saw it for myself. I didn't mean to, but a man doesn't ignore the obvious. I'd finished a late job for an old farmer who needed his gate hinges fixed before the next storm rolled in. On the drive home, I caught sight of Joanne's car parked outside a place that had no reason to see her this late at night. Graves Inc., the only tattoo shop in Ironwood. I pulled into the next lot over, killed the engine, and sat there. 5 minutes passed. 10. Then the door opened, and she walked out, her hand tucked into the arm of a man who didn't belong in my world. Daniel Graves. City guy. Came around every few months to do custom ink jobs for people looking to mark something permanent on their skin. He was younger, maybe mid-40s, always dressed in black like he was trying too hard. Long fingers, the kind that never knew a hard day's work. He stood too close, like he thought he had a right to. She let him. I didn't move. Didn't storm in there like some jealous fool looking to make a scene. I just watched. Took in every detail. Joanne tipped her face up to his, her expression something I hadn't seen directed at me in years. Not the look a wife gives a husband. They kissed. Not the kind of kiss that left any room for doubt. I turned the key in the ignition and drove home. She came in an hour later, the same routine, the same half-lie. Meeting went late. I nodded, barely looking up from my workbench. Didn't need to ask any more questions. I had my answer. I let it sit for a few days. No accusations, no scenes. Just quiet observation. People show you who they are when they think you're not looking. And Joanne had shown me everything I needed to know. The forge kept me steady. I worked through orders, focused on the weight of the hammer, the heat of the metal, the rhythm of the anvil. It had always been that way. When my father died, when money got tight, when the world tried to push in from all sides, the forge kept me anchored. But this wasn't just another problem to muscle through. This required a different kind of fire. Tommy Preston, my apprentice, caught me staring too long at a piece of iron I hadn't moved in minutes. "You all right, boss?" he asked, setting down his tongs. I snapped back to the present, lifted the iron, and slammed the hammer down hard. The clang echoed through the shop. "Fine. You finished the order for Miller's Gate?" He hesitated, watching me for something I wasn't about to explain. "Yeah, just about." "Then don't waste time talking." Tommy nodded, got back to work. He was a good kid. Smart, dependable, didn't ask too many questions. I liked that about him. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table, watching Joanne move around like nothing had changed. Like she wasn't slipping off to some two-bit tattoo artist while I spent my days keeping a roof over our heads. "How's the fundraiser?" I asked, taking a sip of coffee. She turned, tucking a loose strand of auburn hair behind her ear. "Slow. People just aren't donating like they used to." "Maybe you need a new face to push it," I said, watching her reaction. "Somebody fresh. You know, someone like Daniel Graves." Her whole body stiffened for half a second before she caught herself. She forced a laugh. "Daniel? What makes you say that?" I shrugged, setting my cup down. "Just a thought. He's got an artistic touch. Maybe people would open their wallets for someone like him." She turned back to the stove, stirring whatever excuse for dinner she was making. "I don't think he's interested in that kind of thing." No, I bet he wasn't. Later that night, when she was in the shower, I took her phone off the nightstand. I wasn't the kind of man to snoop, never had been. If you had to go digging, you already knew the answer. But I needed proof, not for my peace of mind. I had none left to lose, but for what came next. The texts were exactly what I expected. Late-night plans. Complaints about feeling trapped. Promises whispered in the dark. She didn't even bother hiding his number under a fake name. Just D. The last message was from him, sent an hour ago. "Can't wait. Same place." I locked the screen and put the phone back where I found it. The next morning, I called in a favor. Ray Gentry answered on the second ring. "Didn't take you long," he said before I even spoke. "You still got that old press pass?" I asked. He chuckled. "You got something worth printing?" "I need a name, a signature, and a donation trail," I said, leaning against my truck. "Something that ties Daniel Graves to charity fraud." There was a pause. Then Ray exhaled. "Damn, you're not screwing around." "Not today." Another pause. Then, "I'll see what I can do." I hung up and got back to work. Nothing changed in my routine. I still hammered steel, still filled orders, still played the part of the steady husband. But under the surface, I was setting the fire. That evening, Joanne left again. Same excuse, same time. I didn't follow. I didn't need to. I already knew exactly where she was going. Instead, I spent the night planning. By morning, Daniel Graves would have his name attached to a cause that would bury him deep enough that even Joanne wouldn't be able to dig him out. The forge had taught me patience. And patience, I knew, was how you made steel stronger, or how you broke a man who didn't see the hammer coming. Ray called 2 days later, early in the morning before the forge had even warmed up. I let the phone buzz in my pocket while I finished securing a length of steel in the vise, then answered without preamble. "You got it." Ray let out a satisfied grunt. "Got more than that. Graves ain't just an idiot, he's a careless idiot. Turns out, he's been running under-the-table cash work on his tattoo business to avoid taxes. Some of that money went straight into your wife's little fundraiser. Thing is, that fundraiser account, the way you set it up, it doesn't actually belong to him, does it?" "No, it doesn't," I said, tightening a bolt. "And the funds he donated from his business, in his name, now show up as illegal transactions?" "That's right." Ray let out a low whistle. "Jesus, you're meaner than I thought." I didn't answer. There was nothing else to say. By noon, I had every piece in place. The fraudulent charity account, the funds shifting hands just enough times to draw legal attention, and a carefully placed anonymous tip to the Ironwood Gazette, a paper still small enough that it had to chase scandal to sell copies. The next morning, the headline was waiting. "Local artist implicated in fraud scheme." I was at the forge when Joanne stormed in, gripping the newspaper so tight the edges curled. "What the hell is this?" she snapped, shoving it toward me. I took my time setting down the hammer, wiping my hands off on a rag before taking the paper from her. I skimmed the article, even though I already knew every word. Daniel Graves, suspected of illegal financial activities. Donations linked to his name under investigation. Possible tax fraud charges. I let the paper drop onto the workbench. "Looks like he's in trouble." She was breathing hard, her face flushed, but not from embarrassment. From anger. "Did you do this?" I picked up the hammer again. "Why would I?" Her jaw clenched. Because you knew." I met her eyes then, steady, unblinking. "Yeah, I knew." Her whole body sagged, like she'd been bracing for impact and just realized the train had already hit. She backed up, fingers tightening around the edge of the workbench. "Spencer." I swung the hammer down, hard. The clang echoed through the shop. She jumped. "You want to tell me how long you were planning on keeping up the lies?" I asked, voice even. She swallowed. "I don't." I cut in. "I don't want to hear excuses. I don't want to hear it just happened, or, I didn't mean to hurt you. I turned fully toward her now, rolling the stiffness from my shoulders. You knew exactly what you were doing. Every time you left, every time you lied to my face, you made a choice. She shook her head, eyes glassy. I was unhappy. I let out a breath through my nose. And you think I wasn't? That shut her up. I took a step closer, voice dropping lower. You think I didn't notice? You think I didn't see the way you looked at me like I was just another part of the furniture in this house? Like I wasn't a man, just some obligation you outgrew. Tears welled up, but I wasn't interested in them. Not now. I never wanted to hurt you, she whispered. I shook my head, stepping back. Doesn't matter what you wanted, Joanne. What matters is what you did. She covered her mouth with one hand, fingers trembling. What happens now? I picked up the newspaper again, folded it neatly, and set it back on the table. What happens now is Graves gets what's coming to him. And you? You live with what you chose. Her lip quivered. Spencer. I was already walking past her, grabbing my coat. Lock up when you leave. And I didn't look back. I drove into town, not because I needed anything, but because I didn't want to sit in that house listening to the sound of a woman realizing she had burned her own home down. Ironwood wasn't big. You lived here long enough, and you got to know every crack in the sidewalk, every faded sign, every story behind why this building was built and why that one was torn down. I parked outside Gentry's usual spot, a dingy little diner that served coffee thick enough to hold a spoon upright. Ray was already inside, nursing a cup, flipping through the paper like he hadn't already memorized the best parts. He looked up when I slid into the booth across from him. You look like a man who just took the final shot in a long game. I waved down the waitress. Coffee. Ray smirked. She take it well? I ignored that. Graves. Ray tapped the newspaper. FBI took an interest in the tax evasion bit. He's got some explaining to do. Not to mention the fun little fraud situation. He leaned back, stretching. If I had to guess, he'll skip town before they get the chance to slap cuffs on him. He ain't the type to stand his ground when the fire gets hot. I nodded. That sounded about right. A man like that, he took what he could when things were easy and ran when they weren't. No roots, no real fight in him. The waitress dropped off my coffee, and I took a sip, letting the heat settle in my chest. Ray watched me over the rim of his cup. What about Joanne? I exhaled, rubbing the bridge of my nose. What about her? He lifted a shoulder. I don't know. She gonna try and fix this? I stared at the black surface of my coffee. Can't fix what's already dead. Ray snorted. Some men would have burned the whole thing down. I met his eyes. I did. He chuckled low. Yeah, I suppose you did. I finished my coffee, left some cash on the table, and walked back to my truck. The sun was setting now, bleeding orange over the rooftops. I drove home, not because I wanted to, but because it was still my house, my life, my name on every deed and document that mattered. She was still there when I walked in, sitting at the kitchen table, staring at nothing. A nearly empty bottle of wine sat beside her, glass in hand, untouched. She looked up when she heard me, eyes red-rimmed, but she didn't say anything. I took off my jacket, hung it on the hook, and leaned against the counter. You staying? She blinked, then looked away. I don't know. I nodded, running my fingers along the grain of the wood. I won't stop you if you go. She swallowed hard, setting the glass down. I don't want to lose everything. I let that sit between us, heavy as iron. You already did. Her breath hitched, but she didn't argue. I pushed off the counter, walked past her toward the back door. Stopped with my hand on the frame. I won't be here tomorrow. You do what you need to do. And then I stepped outside into the cool night air, letting the door close behind me. The next few weeks blurred together. The days were full of the usual orders from the locals, fixing tools and gates, always something to hammer or weld. The rhythm of the forge never changed. But everything else did. Joanne didn't leave. She didn't stay either. She lingered around the house like a shadow, her presence heavy in the silence. She barely spoke. When she did, it was usually something about the house or the bills. Nothing personal, nothing real. I didn't need her to say much. I already knew what the next steps were. One evening, after finishing up a job for the local rancher, I walked in the house to find her sitting at the kitchen table again. This time, though, she wasn't staring off into space. She had a stack of papers in front of her, some kind of list. I stopped in the doorway, watching her. She didn't notice me at first, too caught up in her own thoughts. When she finally looked up, her eyes were tired, like she hadn't been sleeping. I've been thinking, Spencer, she said, the words quiet, almost like she didn't want to say them out loud. You don't need to, I answered. She set the papers down, pushing them toward me. I want to fix this. I want to make things right. I didn't move. I didn't take the papers. You already made your choice, Joanne. You did that the moment you decided to leave and lie to me. She flinched, but there was no anger in my voice, just cold, hard facts. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Spencer, she said, her voice cracking slightly. You just what? I cut in, stepping into the room. You think you can undo what's already done? You can't fix it. You can't change it. You just want me to pretend it didn't happen. I never wanted to hurt you, she whispered, looking down at the table, her fingers tugging at a loose thread in the cloth. I stood there for a long moment, just watching her. There was nothing left to say. You'll figure it out, I said, turning toward the door. You always do. I didn't stay for the response. I didn't need to. The next few days were just as quiet. Joanne kept herself busy, cleaning and reorganizing the house like it might somehow erase what had happened. It didn't matter. Every time I walked in, the place felt colder. Her presence didn't fill the house anymore. It just made it feel empty. I kept my focus on the forge. The orders kept coming in. The work didn't stop. People needed their tools, their gates, their horseshoes. And I was the man who provided them. My hands were calloused and rough from the hours spent hammering steel, but they were steady. They always had been. One afternoon, Tommy came by to help with a big order. He was starting to get the hang of things, handling the heat, swinging the hammer with more confidence. He asked if I was doing okay, if I needed any help with things at home. I shook my head. Some things you don't ask help for, I said. Some things you just do on your own. He nodded, not pressing any further. He understood more than I gave him credit for. The days stretched into weeks, and the house stayed just as quiet. Joanne was still there, but she wasn't really living in it. She had become a stranger to me. I had become one to her, too. One morning, I came in from the forge to find her standing by the door with a suitcase. She had been packing while I worked. I'm leaving, she said, her voice steady but thin. I stopped, watching her for a long moment. I had expected this, but that didn't mean it didn't hit. You don't have to go, I said, keeping my voice low. She looked at me, as full of something I couldn't name. Yes, I do. There was nothing else left to say. I watched her go, her footsteps light as she crossed the yard and got into her car. I stood there, feeling the weight of the moment. But there was no anger, no bitterness. Just the quiet certainty that some things are meant to burn. The forge was still there. My work was still there. And for the first time in a long while, I was at peace with the silence. The days after Joanne left were different, but they weren't empty. The forge had a rhythm that didn't change. The clang of steel, the hiss of hot iron in the water, the steady pressure of the hammer in my hand, it all felt the same. I still worked long hours, still did what had to be done. The world outside kept turning, and I kept making sure it stayed together for the people who mattered. Tommy worked more with me now, taking on bigger jobs, handling the smaller orders. He was learning quick. He had the steady hands for it, and the patience. I liked that about him. We didn't talk much. There was no need. When the forge was hot, we worked. When the work was done, we left. It was simple, direct. And I wasn't the kind of man to fill silence with empty words. One evening, after we'd wrapped up for the day, I was locking up when Ray pulled up in his cab. He had that smirk on his face, the one that told me he was about to drop something heavy. You look like a man who got what he wanted, Ray said, leaning against the hood of his car. I didn't say anything at first. Just leaned on the doorframe, waiting for him to spit it out. He's gone, Ray said after a beat, flicking his cigarette to the ground. Graves. Took off. Packed his things, left town in the middle of the night. Word is, he's not coming back. I didn't feel anything hearing that. Not relief, not satisfaction, just a small nod. That's the way men like him operated. Run when the heat gets too high. Figures, I muttered. Coward. Ray laughed under his breath. Yeah, but it's always the cowards who get away with it. You, on the other hand, look like a man who just walked away clean. I didn't respond. Ray liked his little mysteries, his stories, but that wasn't the kind of thing I cared to unpack. I'd handled it, and now I was done with it. That night, I didn't go home immediately. I wasn't sure why, but I ended up outside, sitting on the steps of the old church near the edge of town. The evening was quiet, too quiet. The kind of quiet that felt like the whole world was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. I was halfway through my second cigarette when a car pulled up. I didn't look at it right away. I already knew who it was. Mind if I sit? A voice asked from the side. I turned and saw Sarah Merritt standing there, her hands tucked in her jacket pockets, her eyes scanning the street like she was trying to decide if this was the place to be. I didn't say anything, just leaned back against the church steps and nodded toward the space beside me. She took a seat without another word, and we both sat there for a while, staring out at the empty street, the night air sharp with the smell of rain coming. I saw him leave, she said eventually, breaking the silence. Graves. Packed up, drove off in the middle of the night like a damn ghost. Yeah, I said. He'll be back when things settle down. They always do. She was quiet for a moment, then looked over at me. You ever think about what could have been? If it had gone different? I met her eyes then. No point in thinking like that. She nodded, and for a moment, I thought she was going to say more, but she didn't. Instead, we both just sat there. She wasn't the kind of woman to ask for sympathy or attention, and I respected that. She didn't press for more than what was offered. That was something I could respect. After a while, she stood up. I'm headed back. I'll see you around, Spencer. I didn't answer right away. Just watched her walk back to her car, the sound of her boots fading into the night. She had her own battles. She knew how to fight them. The next morning, the sun was up early. I had work to do. But there was no rush. I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't a big thing. Just a quiet, steady realization that life wasn't going to stop for anyone. It didn't care about what you lost or what you fought for. It just kept moving forward. I grabbed my coat and headed back to the forge. I didn't need to look behind me. I didn't need to check for what was gone. Everything I needed was right in front of me, in the heat of the fire, in the ring of the hammer, in the sweat on my brow. That was enough. The days bled into each other, the rhythm of the forge grounding me, keeping me steady. Joanne was gone. Graves was gone. And the whole damn mess that came with him had burned itself out. I didn't feel like I'd won. Winning was a distraction. I felt like I'd come out the other side of a fire, and now all that was left was the work. The metal. The fire. Everything else? Didn't matter. Tommy was running the shop with me now, his hands steady, his focus sharp. He still didn't ask questions, just worked. I respected that. He learned the trade the way it was meant to be learned, piece by piece, strike by strike. No shortcuts, no distractions. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low behind the hills, Sarah showed up at the forge, carrying a small leather bag. She didn't say anything at first, just watched me hammer a piece of steel into shape. The rhythm of the hammer and the heat from the forge had become a kind of language for me. There was no need for words unless they mattered. Finally, she spoke. You ever think about what comes next? I didn't stop working, just let the question hang in the air. What do you mean by that? She stepped closer, eyes on the anvil, then up at me. I mean, after all this. After everything that happened. I hit the steel with another hard blow, letting the question settle in. I already know what comes next. You don't stop. You don't quit. You keep making what you're meant to make. You don't waste time wondering what's behind you. She nodded, like she understood. Guess that's why I'm here. I finally stopped, wiped the sweat from my brow with the back of my hand, and looked her square in the eye. And what exactly are you here for? She smiled, but it wasn't soft, wasn't full of emotion. It was just a simple acknowledgement of something shared. You're not the only one who knows how to make things last. We didn't need to say anything else. The connection was clear enough. The next few weeks were filled with the same steady rhythm, hammering, shaping, teaching Tommy, taking on new orders. The work didn't stop, and neither did I. The shop became busier, the town had more people coming through, and the business started to grow. I didn't need to watch it happen. I knew it would. This was the way of things. One evening, as I walked home from the forge, I saw Joanne's old car parked outside the house. I stopped, just for a second, watching it. I could feel her presence even without seeing her. She wasn't there, but I knew what she wanted. The same thing she always wanted. Someone to come back, someone to fill the hole she had left behind. I didn't go inside. I didn't have to. The house wasn't home anymore. The forge was. By the time I turned around and started walking toward the shop again, I didn't feel anything. No regret, no bitterness. Just the solid satisfaction of knowing I had put the work in. The next morning, Tommy was already working on the new order from the ranch. He looked up as I walked in, nodding toward the fire. Got the pieces ready, boss. All set. I didn't say anything, just nodded. The fire was good. The work was good. And that was enough. Later, Sarah came by again, this time carrying a few pieces of her own work, metal sculptures that she'd been making in her spare time. She laid them down on the table, eyes watching me as I picked them up one by one. Not bad, I said, inspecting the smooth curves, the clean lines. Got a good eye for this. But you're going to need more heat if you want it to last. She raised an eyebrow. You gonna show me how, then? I looked up at her, meeting her eyes. I don't have to. You already know. And just like that, everything that needed to be said had already been said. There was no drama, no empty promises. Just the knowledge that we both knew exactly where we stood. By the end of that week, the shop was running smoother than ever. Orders were being filled faster. Tommy was handling more responsibility, and the money was good. But what felt better wasn't the profits. It was the quiet satisfaction of knowing that, in the end, I had built something that wasn't going to fall apart. I didn't care about the past anymore. The past was behind me, a distant memory in the rear view. What mattered now was the work, the forge, the future. And with that, I turned back to the anvil, the hammer in my hand, ready to strike. This time, I didn't need to wonder what came next. It was already right in front of me, and I was ready for it.